All right, so this is another workshop, a philosophy workshop by the peer tutoring program. My name is Paul Michael. I run the program. We're going to be recording this and posting it on YouTube. Um, yeah, without further ado, this workshop is going to be led by Jonah, who's one of our longstanding tutors, and he'll say more about that.
Cool. Hi to people here, people who are going to watch this later. Yeah, I'm Jonah. So the history of this kind of workshop, what we're going to be looking at, comes from tutoring and my own experience writing papers at Cal. So just very briefly, I did not do very well my first semester. I think I got 1A and 2 B minuses. And a lot of that was due to my papers being kind of all over the place, not necessarily badly written, but not sticking to what the prompt asked and fully responding to what the prompt asked. So kind of like throughout that first year, I really developed this system that I held myself accountable to of deconstructing prompts and creating really rigorous outlines to the point where it would usually take me a day to write any paper once I'd finished outlining, less than a day, sometimes as little as 3 or 4 hours. And that these papers started to really increase in quality until the point that in my senior year back-to-back, those semesters using this system I'm going to kind of bring to you were both straight A semesters with mostly straight A papers. And, you know, I think the first thing that I want to start with is that if you're one of those people, and I know these people who just really get like the way they best work is through just rewriting papers over and over and over again. And they'll do 1 draft, 2 draft, 3 drafts, 4 drafts. I still think what we're going to bring you in this workshop, and Paul is going to chime in with his experience on some of these things, is that what we're going to bring you is going to be really useful for the organizational work you're going to do before you start writing. So this is by no means like a research proven best way to outline as much as it is an illustration of my experience of how it's been best to get to a place where I'm fully ready to write. And where that writing that I then do is stress-free and pretty easy and is just a matter of me worrying about prose rather than what I want to actually say. Which in philosophy, especially in our discipline, getting clear on what you want to say before worrying how you want to say it is kind of an important detail. So I just kind of want to go through this initial document, which is how to deconstruct a prompt. So this might not be useful for your whole career, especially if you you go to grad school and their prompt writing is not so much of a thing. But while you're here, you're going to be given papers with prompts in pretty much every class in philosophy you're going to take. And this document that we're going to go through right now, its purpose is to do those 3 bullet points that I have shared with you. So it's identify the different tasks that the prompt is asking you to do. So it's to get a to-do list. Learn whether the prompt is asking you to be explicative or argumentative, and if both, when you should be which, and about what. And we'll get to what those mean later. And then it should give you the skeleton that begins the outline of your paper. So I want to give everyone on here just a moment to read the prompt that I am outlining. This is a prompt that I wrote for a class that I took on Aristotle. And it's a real prompt that I wrote on, and just take a minute and read it over. So for the purpose of this activity, don't get too caught up on what any of these technical terms mean. I mean, if you want to, if you're a fan of Aristotle or you think philosophical accounts or psychology are interesting, go up and look up what practical nous is. I promise you it's a very interesting concept. But the thing you should focus on is this is just a chunky paragraph that's asking you a lot of questions. And it's not actually providing you with a lot of detail of what it is you ought to be doing, at least at first read. And it feels to me, when I get handed prompts like this, a little intimidating. I don't know how to start on it. So the first thing I do is I literally just separate every sentence into bullet points. And the first thing that does is it kind of removes the intimidation factor. I'm not just staring at a block of text anymore. I'm staring at discrete sentences that each have their own point. And that it also lets me see what parts of the prompt are giving me the context of what the prompt is supposed to be about, and what part of the prompt is asking me to do certain things. So the first thing that jumps out at me is that the first two sentences of this prompt don't tell me to do anything. They're not any instructions. They don't ask for the paper to be any certain sort of way. They just kind of situate you in, this is a paper about acrasia and practical news. So we can delete those sentences in our prompt deconstruction, and we wind up getting these 5 bullet points, which are going to be our to-do list. And it's, how should we understand? What role does it play? What sort of breakdown? Why should we think? Critically assess. These are the kind of coded words. I mean, I'm sure you're going to be able to spot them on your own, but these are the kind of coded words that you want to be on the lookout for as something that indicates an instruction that you need to do in your paper. So I'm going to pause right here and see if Paul has anything to add before we move on just about getting clear on finding everything that the prompt is asking you to do.
No, I think this looks good, and I'll maybe chime in a little bit later.
For sure. Just let me know. So this should take about 30 seconds to do, probably less, but like just doing this has moved us from like a big block chunk of paragraph to 5 discrete tasks that you're going to have to do in your paper. And that's a big move in terms of actually getting ready to write. So the next thing that I do when I deconstruct a prompt is I separate what part of the prompt is asking for explication and what part of the prompt is asking for argumentation. So explication is when in a paper we break down and explain another philosopher's thoughts or arguments. And we do so in the most straightforward and most charitable way possible. Sometimes this will involve exegesis, which exegesis is critical interpretation and reading, sometimes line by line reading of the text in order to bring forward an interpretation. Argumentation, on the other hand, is when we assess other people's thinking or we forward our own kind of argument. And it usually involves formulating claims, responses, criticisms, and defense. Those will be kind of the 4 elements of your argumentation. So if I were doing this prompt again, I would split it up this way. Explication would have the first 3 bullet points, argumentation the second. So the reason that I would organize them this way is that when I see the words assess, why should we think, do I think philosopher X was right? It's a dead giveaway that the prompt wants me to be argumentative about the question or the statement. The other big difference is that the first 3 aren't asking what you think. They're asking you to explain what Aristotle thinks. And not every paper, in fact, you're probably going to wind up taking at least a few classes that are going to ask you to be solely explicative. I don't know that there's any class I've taken that's asked me to be solely argumentative. But aside from that, every paper is going to have one segment where you're regurgitating the thought of another thinker in the clearest and most charitable way possible. And the parts that directly address the questions that the prompt is asking you to, and there'll be another part where you assess it. And most of the time, it's going to be explication, then assessment, though we'll get to that later. So basically, if you do this with every prompt you have, you're going to wind up with this to-do list that you get to organize your outline around. And most of the prompts you receive are going to be fairly similar to this example. And deconstructing them are not only going to leave you in a good position to start writing your outline, they're going to leave you in a good position to start writing an outline that meets what your grader expects. And the reason that is most of our GSIs, most of our graders are going to be grading with the prompt in front of them, or at least nearby them. And they're going to be expecting you to hit every single line in that prompt. And usually they're going to expect it in that order that the prompt asks you. So even just doing the deconstruction this way is going to help you for when you start writing your outline is going to be in the order that the person who's grading your paper is going to expect. So this was just a little brief, how do we get from a prompt to beginning to outline? And I want to pause a little bit here just to give everyone kind of a breath, see if Paul has anything to say before we go to actually outlining.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jonah. So yeah, I would say one thing that I find really helpful at this stage is to when I've broken down the prompt and I sort of see all of the tasks that I need to do, I think about how much space I have in the paper. So let's say, I mean, I don't know, how long of a paper was this? Like 4 or 5 pages?
8 pages.
8 pages, never mind. Well, 8 pages, right? So we have 5 tasks, 2 major parts. One part where we're explaining Aristotle's view, and the other part where we're arguing for certain views. And so just think about how much time you want to spend on each task, especially when you're writing and making your outline. And also take these questions very literally. So I like to contrast philosophy prompts with other types of prompts in the humanities, like English prompts, where for an English prompt, I used to be a literature major, right? For an English prompt, often the prompt is sort of like guidelines that you loosely need to hit. But the most important thing for writing a good English paper is to write something interesting, given the prompt that you're given. But for a philosophy prompt, at least in a very analytical department like ours, you need to take these questions very literally, and the task of the paper is to thoroughly, thoughtfully answer every single part of the prompt that you're given. So yeah, just bear that in mind when you're breaking down these prompts, making your outlines, and writing your papers, because I think it's really helpful.
So I want to say 2 other things about what Paul brought up just before we pivot to outlining. Actually, 3 things. First, very brief thing is, once you've deconstructed your prompt, if it is at all possible, go to your professor or your GSI and double check your understanding. Because there will be some prompts where it's like, I was tutoring a Descartes prompt the other day, and the prompt talks about a pretty big section of text. And I was like, I honestly don't know what to tell you. You should go to your GSI and specifically say, it can refer to this chunk, or both chunks. Which chunk should I be talking about? Like, what specifically is it asking me to analyze? So we'll get to that in a little bit once we're getting to outlining. But the other 2 things are just on this kind of note of being interesting, which is you should, and this is just my honest to God experience, if I do my best to answer a prompt whose questions I think are interesting, the paper will be interesting, just in trying to answer the questions. And so this is not something I really talked about in this document or have talked about so far. But like when you're selecting a prompt, and in most classes, you're going to have somewhere between 3 and 5 prompts to pick from, sometimes as little as 2, sometimes as many as 8. Like, look through all the prompts and go, like, which of these do I think I can do and which of these do I find interesting? And if there's a prompt that hits both, like just at first read, like that's the one you should do. And then proceed with your deconstruction, rather than picking a prompt idly and saying, I don't even find this interesting. I don't know why I'm writing about Rawls's theory of the family when I don't find Rawls interesting, for example. So, you know, just another thing to think about. So I'm going to move us to doing an outline.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah.
Before I forget, there's one more thing that I wanted to say about deconstructing your prompt. I actually forget if I've said this, but in general, you can read the structure of your paper off of the structure of the prompt. And so, I mean, we've broken it down where there's an explication part and argumentative part. So, I mean, you can just see like the first few questions are about explaining different parts of Aristotle's view. And then once you do that, you're gonna have to argue for a certain view. So you can, in that way, you can read the structure of your paper off of the prompt. And that sort of goes hand in hand with what I mentioned earlier about keeping in mind how much space you want to allocate for each task. This is just something that tends to make your writing more polished, and it's really helpful. So
Cool. Thank you, Paul. So here's where we're going to get into outlining. So my calculation of my papers is every good grade I've gotten is 75% good outlining and only 25% actual essay writing. Now that's my experience, and it might not be everyone's experience, but most of what goes into me having a good paper happens before I've even done a keystroke of prose. So the nice thing about writing an outline, and I'm going to recommend in this segment writing multiple drafts of your outline, is it ensures good organization and clarity. So we've talked about organization before when we were talking about prompt deconstruction. Now we're going to talk about clarity and being really clear on what you're going to talk about. So let's return to the prompt. So you've read this before. This time it's just included, write a paper of no more than 7 pages and submit it by such and such a time. So since we've already done the deconstruction, we already know that we have this explicative and this argumentative sections. And this is actually the beginning of our outline in this method. So the next thing to do is, it's really simple, but it adds clarity. Change the bullet points to enumerated multi-level lists. So just to show you what I mean, you're going to add intro and conclusion, and these are going to be the 4 sections of your papers. Enumerated 1, 2, 3, and 4 with subsection heads under explication and argumentation. So with some exceptions, like I said, every outline you write and every paper you write is going to have these 4 sections. Some papers you'll need to be a little argumentative inside of the explication. Some papers you're going to need a little explication inside of the argumentation, but by and large, these are going to be your section heads. So this is so as a kind of final thought, the other really good upshot of organizing a paper this way is once you get to writing longer papers, 15-page plus papers, 20-page papers, keeping the structure of your paper clear of what is going on is, in this part of the paper, I'm introducing you to the problem. In this part of the paper, I'm solving the problem or providing clarity. It becomes even more important than in these shorter 3, 4, 5, 6-page papers. So the next thing that I want to do whenever I'm working on from a deconstruction to an outline is I want to rephrase each question into a statement of what I intend to do in that part of the essay. So with this deconstruction, I might do this. So I've rephrased how should we understand Aristotle's notion of practical nous to explanation of practical nous. What role does it play in our practical deliberation? Practical nous's role in practical deliberation, etc. So if you look at argumentation, you'll notice that there's a difference here. In A, I wrote argue for this connection. And in B, I've left it open-ended. Assessment of Aristotle's idea of acrasia. The reason that is that at this stage in my outline, sometimes I'm not sure what I want to wind up arguing, and I'm just getting clear on what goes here. What am I going to be doing here? So you may wind up doing this pretty often, and it just leaves your options open to decide where you're going to land while still continuing to build up your structure. So often I might even have someone take a look at my outline, or I'll go to office hours and I'll say, hey, this is what I'm thinking of my approach for my paper. And as I do so, I'm going to try and talk through the very basic ideas of the outline. And having this structure open and in front of me, in a weird way, this is even easier through Zoom than it is through in-person office hours. I'm going to have an organized place that I can put all of the feedback I get, whether it's from my professor or a GSI or a friend reading it. So let's say I'm taking this Aristotle class, I'm writing this paper, I go to office hours, and in the office hours, I start talking through with my GSI, hey, what do you think I would need to do to answer some of these questions or to do some of these things? So if I did that, I might walk away from the office hours with a little more information. So, section 2A, it now has some instructions from let's say the GSI gave me. I have to be sure to contrast nous with episteme. I need not linger on what episteme is. If I go down to 3A in argumentation, you can see that just from talking to my GSI, that maybe a good reason to argue for this connection is that it matches with our everyday experience. The point is, I haven't even opened the book. I haven't even started working through doing any critical interpretation. I haven't done any kind of work other than showing up at office hours, and I'm still getting more thoughts on what it is I'm doing in this paper that are organized and structured. So one of the things that I like to do is ask the question, where do I find such and such? Or what does the answer to this part of the prompt look like? And, you know, as I work to kind of answer those questions or to take up the suggestions from whoever's office hours I went to, I'll start to slowly integrate things into the outline. And I may need to discover that there's extra things that I need to do that aren't listed in the prompt in order to actually achieve what the prompt is asking me to achieve. So an example of this is actually going to roll over into the next page, and then we're going to take a little pause, is something like here. So why don't I just stop talking and give y'all a little bit to just look over what this version of the outline looks like. So the main thing I want to point your attention to is that in this version, and we'll make sure to keep a Drive version of these documents accessible so that you can pull them up and read them and contrast the different versions, is that this one includes, I guess you could call it sub-instructions, that in order to explain practical news, or in order to explain the question that I need to explain in the paper, I first have to introduce acrasia. Now that's not in the prompt per se, but I have to introduce it. I have to define it in terms of the different views that were available. And this is, again, I haven't picked up a book. I haven't done any critical interpretation. All I've done is think about, what do I need to do to answer what the prompt is telling me? And I've slotted it into the structure that I've provided myself. So, Paul, do you have anything to add here?
Not here. I'll say a little bit more later, but go ahead.
Okay. So basically, once you're at the point where you're decently sure of everything that you have to do, so that is, you've deconstructed the prompt, you've rephrased your deconstruction, you've taken your deconstruction to your GSI or your professor and gone, am I missing anything here? You've filled in what you might be missing, and then you've thought further about what else you would have to do in order to talk about what you need to talk about. You're going to have a fairly fleshed out outline. And from working on that, and you can take kind of periodic breaks to check back in with your GSI or professor, or check in with a friend, you're going to be at a place where once you're starting to write your prose, you know every single thing you're going to say and exactly where you're going to say it in the paper and how it connects to your overall point. So the only other thing I'd say here is that once your outline is filled out, and you'll know your outline is filled out enough when you can copy and paste each section into your prose document and have nothing missing. That is, you might need to type some connective sentences. You might need a few extra prose sentences to explain what you mean, but there will be nothing missing from when you go from your outline to your prose. The other upshot of doing it this way, of having a really fleshed out outline with having gone through 3 or 4 iterations, is it prevents this tendency that we sometimes have in philosophy, and I say we because I notice it in others and not just me, to totally misassess the amount of explanation that a point needs. I think one of the things that sabotages most philosophic writing is giving an idea that should be half a sentence, a paragraph, and giving the idea that needs to be 2 paragraphs, 2 sentences. So as a final little example, I wanted to give you a part of the outline from an actual philosophy of perception paper I wrote, that this is what just one section of the outline looked like before I started writing. So I'll give you all a moment to just look over that. So like, again, don't get caught up on the technical ideas here or what is the Goldilocks argument, so much as what I'm pointing out is that this is what just one section looked like that had everything I knew I needed to say before I ever started writing the paper. So I hope that this will really assist you in constructing your outlines. Again, I think reading through the documents on your own and being able to compare and contrast the different evolutions of the outline will be helpful, perhaps more helpful than me talking you through it. But the only other thing I'd want to add is that, you know, it's not a particularly stress-free time to be a philosophy student right now, and that we all have a lot of distractions. Trust me, I'm trying to apply to grad school right now. And so this idea of being able to sit down and work on a bite-sized thing that doesn't require a tremendous amount of attention, that doesn't require setting aside 8 hours to sit in the library and work on prose when I don't know what I'm doing, that avoids totally the stress of just a blank white screen. where I don't know how to begin, that doing these bite-sized chunks of an outlining task are more important than ever. So, you know, I've attached my email to the end of both these documents. Please feel free to reach out if you ever watch this video or read these documents. I'm happy to answer questions, especially questions about outlining and prompt deconstruction. And I'd also be happy to share some examples of completed outlines that I've done, as well as perhaps gather some more samples of outlines going forward that people have done. So you can see kind of the variety of styles that go into just preparing to write a paper. And I think that's all I've got.
Cool. Thank you so much for that, Jonah. Yeah, I think the only thing I want to add is, well, I think Jonah said this at the beginning. So for anyone who's joined late, none of this is gospel. Like, this is Jonah's way of doing it, and it's very, well thought out and really nicely developed. But some people don't like doing outlines. I know. Yeah, Jonah really likes to have really nice detail outlines, which makes the writing a lot easier. For me, I like to just have like some structure set up, without filling out the outline too much, so that I just have a sketch of what I need to be doing in the paper, and then I can sort of allocate, oh, let's say like I have 3 major sections. It's a 5-page paper. Maybe I'll spend a page and a half on each roughly. So just sort of seeing it visually like that tends to help a lot. I also want to say you can view this whole second exercise about constructing an outline as just sort of in more detail, reading the structure of your paper off of the structure of the prompt.
Yeah.
And the thing that I want to emphasize with that is that, Jonah is able to get all of this detail or all of the structure about, or that will later translate into writing a really clear paper off of the structure, or off of just what the prompt he's given, and like talking with the GSI about the upcoming assignment. So that type of thing. I mean, you can really get a lot of substance for your paper just off of what you're given, before you even crack open the book. Yeah, and then also reiterate, we are the peer tutors, or 2 of them anyway. You can sign up for one-on-one peer tutoring at the philosophy department on the website. If you click, well, I'll attach it below in the notes of the video, but if you click undergraduate and then peer tutoring, you can sign up with us there. So now I'm gonna stop the recording.
Well, the
Thanks so
only
much.
thing I'll add before the recording is stopped is the is Paul pointed out like a major difference between the 2 of us and our styles of outlining. And I think, but even, and Paul, you can correct me if I'm wrong, something that kind of surpasses the difference between us and is going to be useful to everyone, I'm convinced, is you're going to be having thoughts and new readings and new ideas about what you're writing about as you're writing the paper. And having an outline, even if it's just a basic sketch that has the structure, lets you put the idea written down in a place where you know you're going to talk about it later, to come back to and go and reach that point of the outline as you're writing, and you go, oh, that's right, I had that idea that I should talk about, Shun's research in Confucian ethics for this prompt, even though it's not directly related, even if it's just a footnote. So, that's another upshot of outlining, is it helps you keep track of your new ideas.
Yeah, I definitely feel like it's, once I started outlining, my papers just got better and better and more clear. Helped with the structure a lot. So definitely recommend it.